Let's wait a few minutes while people come in.
Looks like wearing glasses is a precondition to participate in SEP's seminars as a speaker.
Would be interesting to see the audience, whether it's the same. Okay, I think I will open the webinar, and slowly people will continue to come in. Good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this webinar, Rethinking the Growth Paradigm, Capitalism, Inequality and Climate Change. I'm Cinzia Cidi, I'm Director of Research at SEPS, and I'm really very pleased to moderate this event. The opportunity for the event is given by this book that you see behind me, Growth for Good, Reshaping Capitalism to Save Humanity from Climate Catastrophe. We have with us the author, Alessio Terzi, is economist at the European Commission and also associate professor at the University of Sciences Po at Lille. And in order to comment on the book, we have with us Barry Eichengreen, professor at Berkeley University of California, and Daniel Gros, a distinguished fellow at SEPS and member of the SEPS board. Why are we discussing this issue, and why we want to have a discussion around this book? I think that the issue is extremely topical. I think there is a lot of interest around this book. Some of you may have seen that Martin Wolf suggests the book as a summer reading in his list published I think a couple of days ago. I think it's not by chance because the book, of course, discusses how actually we can now build a better economic system in which the challenges of climate change and limited resources actually can be taken into consideration without giving up on growth. But I think that the one particularly interesting aspect of the book, at least what I appreciated particularly, is that the book devotes quite a long number of pages to understand really the socioeconomic foundations of the problems that we are facing today. And Alessio does this really in an historical perspective, and also really looking at the evolution of the thinking. And I think this is really interesting. You learn a lot when reading this, and it also helps to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So in this sense, I would definitely recommend to read the book. But it's now time for me to give the floor to Alessio and to tell us about the book. Alessio, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cinzia, for putting this together. Thanks, Daniel, for joining, and Barry, particularly from the other side of the world. I'm extremely delighted to be here. Indeed, the book came out now 3 weeks ago, and I mean, to give you, I've been told that I should give a presentation within 15 minutes with an exclamation mark at the end. So I will really try to stick to as short as possible a description of the book. And indeed, I think you already gave a good snapshot, Cinzia, of what the book is about, in the sense that it has this dual role of explaining what economic growth is, why do we care about it? Does it matter? Does it matter from a social angle? Is it incompatible with, what is its relationship with nature, broadly defined, and climate change more specifically? And then it pivots to a more practical agenda in order to use capitalism as a tool in order to address this challenge. Now, indeed, if there is a fil rouge that connects the whole, the full chapters of the whole chapter, the various chapters of the book, is a bit this historical approach, which is also why I'm extremely delighted to have Barry here with us, and also Daniel. I've been reading some of your material, and indeed I see again that you use this historical angle. I remember a Project Syndicate piece where you were mentioning the switch in time that saved 9, and this whole discussion during the New Deal. So I see that there is a connection also in this virtual room. Now, I think the best way to organize, to just give the listeners a snapshot of what the book is about, I thought was to pull out a few of the points that this book makes. And in particular, I would argue today that the book is a book that tries to shatter some preconceptions or misconceptions in the form of things that sound intuitively right, that are in common parlance and discussions and the media, and not necessarily they are right, or I would argue against. And I do that in 5 points, let's say. So the first point I would make is a bit this link between inequality and growth. And this is something that Barry already pointed light to in his review of the book on current affairs. And there, what I try to say is, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with economic growth in certain circles, particularly in advanced economies, particularly in among millennials and Gen Z, so my generation and below. And I think the reason there is, to a certain extent, we haven't seen that much growth. But aside from that, it is this idea that when we have seen growth for many countries, this has accrued to the top 1%, top 0.1%, to the large corporations and so on. And so there has been a degree of disenchantment with growth, disinterest in it. And many people say, who cares about growth? We should focus on redistribution. It's all about reducing inequality, and therefore we should focus on redistribution. And what I try to say there is, in the book, is beware from a political economy point of view. If you have a steady state economy, an economy without growth, the redistribution you're seeking is actually less likely to happen. And we know that, again, the historical approach, because if we look at what was the situation before the Industrial Revolution and the Great Acceleration or the Great Divergence, we know that these were not societies where redistribution was massive, and surely it wasn't redistribution of the type that we have in mind, from the richest to the poorest, but it was probably from the most powerful, or from the least powerful to the most powerful. And so that is a bit one first angle that I discuss in the book in terms of the link between inequality and growth. A second point I make is on the link between capitalism and growth. And I think the misconception there is that oftentimes the phrasing of this matter is, it sounds like capitalism with a lot of its tools, be it advertisement, be it planned obsolescence, and so on and so forth, is sort of pushing this this demand for more on people who actually would be relatively indifferent. And what I try to argue in the book, again, taking a historical angle, looking at other civilizations, other points in time before capitalism, is to show that actually this quest for more is a feature that we observe throughout human history. And actually, again, a crucial way in which the book is built is that it borrows from various literatures. And there I really try to borrow from a variety of literatures beyond the economic one, beyond history, but also looking at cultural evolutionary biology, sociology, social psychology. And I make the argument that actually this desire for more is an inbuilt feature of humankind, and perhaps I would argue even what has pushed us from being just an average sized mammal to the top of the food chain. And so there is also this link between the quest for more and the use of technology to achieve stuff we want. Which brings me to the third misconception, and that is a bit on the relationship between growth and nature that I was hinting to at the beginning. And there the misconception is that it's often phrased like this desire for more means more stuff. And because the stuff is physical, it has to be extracted, it has to be produced with fossil fuels, it has to be produced by emitting CO2 or greenhouse gases, then the natural consequence is that there's no way to protect the planet that also allows for this quest for more or for economic growth to continue. And there again, I argue strongly against. And what I say is that it might have been the case up until now, but this doesn't have to be the case, and there's nothing inbuilt in the concept of growth, in the concept of more, that says more means more stuff or more means more fossil fuels. And actually, in the moment in which people will be on board with the green transition, and therefore governments are in the position to also pass legislation, regulation, and so on this front, more might mean more nature-based solutions. More might mean more recycled solution, more renewables and what's not, and that is entering in the so-called green growth territory. Even from a theoretical point of view, without even entering into the technological side, but we can do that if you want in the Q&A. The fourth point I make, which is a bit out, let's say, of the mainstream in policy circles, or at least the ones I attend, is the link between climate policy and the international dimension. And there, again, the standard concept, the standard idea is, climate change is a global problem, therefore it requires a global solution. And insofar as we haven't seen that up to now, that is just because, our politicians that are either dumb in the best of cases, or corrupt in the worst of cases, or myopic in the intermediate cases, are failing to understand that we need a different level of cooperation and that humanity must come together to face this common challenge. And while the statement is true as a principle, there's a variety of reasons why I argue that we are not on this walk towards the ultimate binding best scenario, first best case international treaty that is gonna solve climate change top down. And this is due to a variety of reasons. Again, in the book, I take also a historical perspective. I see how changes in climate have played out in the past, also during the Little Ice Age, how it has played out in various parts of the world more recently. And because it will bring scarcity in the form of extreme weather events, and because some countries will be affected first, and because some countries will have technologies and resources to try and reduce this impact, and others do not, and because this will spark migration waves to a certain extent, and so on and so forth. For a variety of reasons, we are actually strolling towards a more tense geopolitical situation. And we are perhaps already seeing some hints of it, even though the book was written before the invasion of Russia by Russia of Ukraine. And therefore, the point I try to make is, look, we need strategies, credible strategies to tackle climate change must respect incentives at the national level, because the national level is where most of the policies will take place. Voila. And this brings me to the fifth point, which is again a point I hear a lot of in macroeconomic, green macro type of circles. And there the argument is a bit along the lines of, this transition is painful, is costly, and it is relatively meager in its benefits, in the sense that what we're doing is that we're switching the fossil fuel option for the green option. And the green option is often more expensive, but we're doing the same thing. So the way it is pictured is, we have the internal combustion engine car, we're switching it to an EV. The EV is more expensive, so I'm paying more to have basically what I already had before. And what I argue in the book is that this is a misconception, and that it is not how the green transition will play out. and that it is using a very narrow focus, and that actually the green transition is probably closer to an industrial revolution in the fact that it requires a reinvention of the whole of production, the whole of consumption, the whole of housing, the whole of transport, agriculture, food, and so on. And we know from the history of when industrial revolutions have happened in the past that, of course, at the beginning, you observe extremely limited productivity improvements because the technologies are still being tested out, tested and trialed and scaled up. But eventually what matters is what will happen afterwards and whether there are waves of secondary innovation. And I would argue that there's huge scope for that, and that it is not a matter of switching your internal combustion engine for an EV, but actually EVs will be reinvented. And actually these new energy sources might easily become cheaper than the fossil fuel alternative. Beforehand, we're already seeing some of it. We're already seeing some of these cost curves take place for solar, for wind, for battery storage, but we're actually likely to see that across the board. And that therefore, because this is closer to an industrial revolution, we know that this will recast comparative advantage across the globe. And countries that have made a success of of having a comparative advantage in certain technologies and certain sectors will have to think hard about how to jump on this opportunity of the green transition or be left behind, which means that you have a direct interest, self-interest, both as a nation and as a company, to take advantage of this and be at the forefront of this revolution. Because if you're a laggard, you're going to be left behind, and that's not good. I could go on for hours because this is obviously my favorite topic, but I will stop here and listen to what others have to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Alessio, also for your capacity to be so concise, but also able to go straight to the point. I would like now to give the floor to Barry to share his thoughts on the book.
Thank you, Cinzia and Seps, for organizing this. Thank you to Alessio for a rich and interesting book. I feel compelled to add thank you to the European Commission for carving out time for one of its economists to do this kind of deep thinking and extensive writing. That seems quite exceptional given the days in which we live. The book is very rich. I have 7 minutes. I'm going to focus on the growth and nature aspect. There are many different dimensions or aspects we could talk about. In terms of growth and nature, it's nice to meet an optimist among the dismal scientists. We economists have our reputation as dismal scientists because we emphasize budget constraints and trade-offs, the limits of the possible. In other words, Alessio's book is a reminder that budget constraints are endogenous. They are what we make of them. We can shift them out or prevent them from shifting in through the investments and other decisions we take. One part of the book engages with the no growth or less growth movement. Naturally, I find Alessio's rebuttal convincing because this is set up in the book kind of as a dialogue between economists and non-economists, and I'm on the economist in the economist camp. The substantive point is that if we want to green the planet or avoid browning the planet, we have to expand our economic capabilities. We need to continue growing the economy, albeit in the right ways. For an economist, this argument is obvious. It is compelling. It is no less important for the obviousness. An important point in the book concerns what economic historians refer to as the relevant counterfactual. One can't calculate the cost of climate change abatement policies by extrapolating the historic growth trajectory and comparing this with the lower trajectory that we may experience because we have to divert significant fraction of available resources away from the production of goods and services, all other things equal. Instead, we need to imagine how that historic growth trajectory will flatten out or reverse sign if we don't invest in climate change abatement. This counterfactual thought experiment is what leads Alessio to the conclusion, to the correct conclusion, that living standards and even physical output may be higher with the appropriate investments in climate change abatement policies than without them. The simplest way of reconciling growth with environmental sustainability, of course, is by taxing brown activities, most straightforwardly through a carbon tax, subsidizing green ones, such as investment in carbon capture technology and facilities. But the most important aspect of this, as Alessio alluded to in his remarks, the most important aspect is the dynamic aspect. We don't simply want to subsidize the installation of existing carbon capture technologies. In addition, we want to encourage investment in the development of new technologies. The question is, in what proportions? Economists have tools for thinking about how much society should invest in the installation of current technology as opposed to investing in the development of new technology. This is an aspect that I would have liked to see discussed at more length, perhaps, in the book. Very basic point here is that these trade-offs are not something that markets left to their own devices will get right, because global climate problems are by their nature global. The decisions of an individual or a firm or a government have external effects for the globe as a whole. They require policy interventions on a global scale to internalize global externalities. So that's another set of issues that I would have liked to see the book address at more length. Alessio alluded to his approach at the conclusion of his prepared remarks. I would have liked to see more discussion of the politics. In other words, do our societies, be they the United States or Belgium or Italy or the European Union, have the political will and the political capacity to implement the appropriate policies? How do we address the climate change deniers, in addition to writing more books like this one? How do we foster the relevant political will? How do we understand the uneven development of that political will? Why is the will to do something about the climate change problem stronger in California than it is in most other US states? So to sound my favorite theme, I think there's a role for history here. Having myself lived through the polluted 1960s here in California, when the smog problem was more severe because of our topography in San Francisco and Los Angeles than in most other major US metropolitan centers. That's an explanation for why the climate change movement is stronger in California than in most other states, but it's a disturbing explanation because we can't change history. It suggests that attitudes may be baked in, as it were. In closing, I would also echo some of the things that Alessio said about the international dimension. We see this within the US as well, in the question of whether some US states like California can lead in ways that cause other states to follow. So a recent example of that is automobile fuel standards, where California has its own fuel standard because it's such a big market that required auto producers and therefore consumers in other states to go along. Auto companies couldn't afford to produce one kind of engine for sale in California and another kind for sale in the other 49 states. So our standards ruled until they were overturned by the Trump administration. and now they're back under the Biden administration. So that in turn points to something that Daniel and I were briefly remarking on before the formal part of this broadcast. When you have that kind of unpredictability and volatility in policies, what is the private sector going to do in response? I think that's a big question for all of us going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry. I would like to invite everyone in the audience who has a question to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen and type in the question. In the meantime, I give the floor to Daniel to share his thoughts.
Thanks a lot, Cinzia, for organizing this, for Alessio to writing the book, and the very insightful comments from Barry. Let me perhaps take one of your observations as a starting point. When I arrived in the United States, fresh from Europe in 1979, I went, my first stop was Los Angeles. And there I was sick for the first 4 weeks because of the smog. And that was for me, coming from Rome, quite a strong experience. Related to that, a few years later, coming back to Europe, I noticed that in the US, especially in California, already people were using unleaded gasoline, and Europe was a latecomer. Right? So it's not that Europe always has been in the forefront. And that brings me to something which I think is implicit in Barry's remark and my own experience, that when one thinks about, let me say, growth in nature, or capitalism in nature, one has to distinguish between localized effects, like smog. Excuse me, there's some noise out here. And effects which are not, or which, of course, the most glaring one is global warming. And, of course, at the same time, between impacts which are visible and measurable, let's say, immediately, and those which are only later. Even the Greeks perhaps knew that when they were denuding their hills to build ships, that later would lead to erosion. And if they let the goats loose on these hills, then basically nothing would grow there anymore. But this was always a thing for the future, and surviving today was a more important issue than what maybe would come when you did these practices. And unfortunately, global warming is, of course, the combination, the most difficult combination of the two. Another point, I will come back to that, is something which you, Alessio, alluded to when you talked about the quest for growth, and that more growth is resource intensive. Now, when I hear that, I always ask myself, what if the quest for growth was not for more and bigger things, but higher quality ones, right? Higher quality is not necessarily equal with more resources. It's usually labor intensive, human capital intensive. Basically, I'm thinking about, let's say, a Swiss watch is no longer appropriate in the time of electronic pieces. But if you look at the way the Swiss construct their houses, right, which might have fewer square and cubic meters than American ones, but in the end, they're much more resource friendly. The same goes for food, right? Do you want to eat 2 more hamburgers, or you want to, whatever, prepare the meat in a different way, or it can also be vegetables, right? So the point is, that is something which is, in my view, too little discussed in this degrowth literature. More doesn't have to mean more quantity. It could also mean more quality. Now, for the economists, we have hedonic price indices, so that actually, right? So we would measure a higher output, but that's not so much my point. My point is that this depends to a very large extent of what people demand, right? I can understand that somebody who is close to starvation needs more rice or more bread, quite clear. Somebody in Europe, or most of Europe and the US, might not need more bread, but perhaps given all the stuff you're throwing away, something which is prepared more carefully, perhaps delivered in a different way, so that you don't throw away too much, and so on. And that is an aspect which comes, if you want, from the bottom. It's something that's very difficult for governments to legislate, but it is something which I think their, let's say, frame of mind in the population which should be fostered. And this brings me to my last point. As Barry, I'm also an economist, and moreover, I went to Chicago. So one could say that these are the most realist of the economists. And you ask yourself, why should anybody do anything against climate change? It's a typical free rider problem. At the national level, okay, you can say we do it in the nation. Then you have the European level, you can say, okay, we do it, everybody together. But then when we come to the international dimension, right, why should we Europeans do anything about it when we are responsible for, I don't know, 8 to 9% of global emissions, right? And the argument always that we would suffer from climate change, or that country X, Y, Z would suffer from climate change, and therefore has an incentive to do something. That argument doesn't convince me, because what we Europeans do will have a small impact, and what any single other country will do, except China perhaps, will have on the global equilibrium will also be negligible. So this is, I think, let's say for me, the positive surprise that somehow it has become at the global level, I was going to say the bon ton, right? It has become pervasive among many different political systems to realize that everybody has and should contribute, even when there's this free rider problem. And that I find difficult to explain. It's a positive surprise, but still. It could be related to, and here come back again to my Chicago origins, to one very famous economist from Chicago, Milton Friedman, who said the business of business is profits, right? An enterprise should just maximize profits, and the government should just give it the incentives so that when it maximizes profits, the shadow prices are correct, right? So as Barry has said, if the governments impose just the right carbon taxes, then every enterprise just maximize profits and be home free. And there's a recent literature, Zingales and others, who say not so fast, right? Perhaps the shareholders might have also somewhat different objectives than pure profit maximization. And that, at least in part of our capitalist system, comes through, right? It is, of course, the shareholders who might vote for big companies. It might also be the owners of small and medium-sized enterprises who, for, let's say, I was going to say almost non-economic reasons, think that profit maximization is not the only thing, and that one has to keep other issues in mind. I think these are the issues which I think you discuss in your book, but these are, for me, the two big mysteries, which are in a sense positive surprises, because they show that if you want the view of the pure, rational, egoistic Homo economicus doesn't always work, at least. And I think that is part of how we then come to your capitalism, which will actually be working for good.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Alessio, I would like to give you the opportunity to react. You received quite a lot of comments, so maybe you pick and choose.
I pick and choose on a few, on the easiest to answer, because some are real tough questions. I think, so there's one point that seems, there's a political economy point that was raised, I think, by Barry at the national level, and then at the international political economy mentioned by Daniel, which allows me to make an even broader point. And that is that what I'm trying to do with this book is to step out of a narrative that we have been, as economists, a bit entrapped in, which is that of framing the climate transition as costs, with limited benefits. And therefore, what it requires is, a full ideological conversion to the cause or to doing good, and that only if you have this doing good dimension will citizens at the national level allow for the green transition to happen, or will nations embark in the green transition at the global level in order to do something nice for the rest of the world. And what I'm trying to get at here is to really reframe this issue and say, there's nothing written in the stars from a technological point of view that says the green option must be more expensive, it must be painful, it must be worse than what we had before, and so on. And actually, the green option and the cheap option might soon be the same. In many cases, they're already the same. And that therefore, it doesn't require this full ideological conversion. And so to sort of answer in a way to Barry's point, I don't want the whole of the US or every US citizen they don't even need to believe in climate change to a certain extent, in the sense that in the moment in which the green option becomes the cheaper option as well, you're reinserted into a mechanism, is a price mechanism, which is at the heart of capitalism. And so while you need that conversion or that early momentum, be it by philanthropists, be it by ambitious governments, be it by pioneering consumers early on, because you need to walk down those learning curves or those cost curves, we are approaching a point where for some of these technologies, this is not even needed. And crucially, the selling point I'm trying to give is this might easily become the case for a variety of options, especially because it moves in two dimensions. So in the moment in which you shift to production in the green dimension, you're shifting capital away from oil and gas, let's say, and it's going to become harder to draw resources for those sectors. It's going to be harder to draw talent for those sectors, and so on and so forth. So you have sort of some brown sectors walking up the cost curves and the green options walking down the cost curves. And so we are sort of at that phase or that point in time. And at the global dimension, I sort of make the same argument. So it's true. And actually, I was really battling with this reflection, because that was a bit the reflection that was prodded on me also at the European Commission, saying, of course, we're very devoted to the green transition as Europeans, but then we are a small group of countries or union at the global level. So what if we turn around and nobody's following us? And what I'm trying to say is, I would argue that the green transition is going to happen, and that is because of the scenarios that Barry was mentioning, in the sense that we can't project that everything continues as it did and compare the green option with the continuation of a trend. That trend doesn't exist. There are two trends ahead of us. One is the planet going to hell, and the other is green policies being rolled out at varying speed. And I would argue that it is in a country's or in a company's self-interest to try and be at the forefront that transition, so to speed up their individual greening to achieve these goals. And that's why I would argue that Europe has even a self-interest in trying to be a pioneer on green transition. And then, of course, there are other policies that I mentioned, like carbon border adjustment, and so on and so forth, in order to try and push also this transition abroad. But I think that, again, emerging markets are also very well aware of the need for this transition, also because the costs of climate change are already upon us. They're already evident, and I think that citizens see that. So when there is a heat wave in India, I don't think that people don't realize, and they think, we can just continue like this, and that's not our problem. Maybe just one other point that is close to my heart, because it allows me to discuss also how the book is structured, is the point that Barry was making on the degrowth literature, let's say, or the alternative reading. And of course, everything you said is right, but perhaps I would do a different framing, in the sense that you framed it as two camps, the economists and the non-economists and so on. And it is really something I was trying to avoid while writing the book, in the sense that I really approached the issue with an open heart and without arriving as the economist trying to lecture people on how to manage scarce resources. Really trying to go through this literature, which at times was painful, but I think it helped me to really drill down and go into a deeper understanding, even as an economist, of things that as economists we give for granted. So even the need for growth, oftentimes as economists we use a shorthand argument of the type, there's public debt, we need to repay for it, therefore we need growth. Yes, it's true, of course, in the short term it's true, but then reading alternative types of literature, it really forces you to question the whole system, and it's like, but why do we have to repay public debt? Well, if you don't repay it, then your interest rates will go up. Okay, but why do we need to have, I don't know, to borrow more, and why can't we redistribute resources or take them from the super wealthy? Well, because, and so, it was really a game of whys. It's those games you play as when you're 5-year-old, and you're like, why do your parents tell you have to go to bed? And you're like, why do I have to go to bed? Because you've got to wake up early. Why do I have to wake up early? Because you've got to go to school. Why do you have to go to school? And so on. And that's a bit how the book is structured. And so not really as two camps, but more as taking some fair arguments, I think, although some inappropriate policy responses to those problems that we're facing. And perhaps I stop here just in case there are Q&As, or I can continue picking on points that have been raised, as you wish.
Thanks a lot. There are actually a couple of questions in the Q&A, but I want to take advantage of my position, and I also would like to ask you a question. And this is really about the role of technology. Now, in the book, you mentioned that the association between growth and inequality is also linked to technological progress and how technology has been developing, and somehow contributing to accruing a big portion of the growth to basically the top level. At the end of the book, technology becomes the solution. So how can we square this? What kind of look we need to take vis-a-vis technology?
No, absolutely. I was using earlier the parallel with an industrial revolution in the sense of the technological scale that we need to put in place to make this happen. But of course, again, there is another side of the history of the industrial revolution, which is the Luddism type of movements, or shatter the machines type of movement, which in a sense warns us to the fact that when there is a rapid technological transition, some people are left behind, some regions are left behind, some professions are left behind, and if you don't do anything about it, those people will be angry, and they will oppose the system, let's say, or whatever is happening. And on top of that, we are using policies actively, be it carbon pricing, regulation, and so on, to accelerate even more the speed of the transition. because we want to reach the goals that climate scientists tell us are important to reach in order to avoid the worst of the worst in terms of climate. And that's where the link with inequality comes in. And in a way, you know, I make the argument, you know, there's a moral argument that you don't want to leave anybody behind. But again, I try to be very pragmatic here. And I make almost a practical argument about it. And here I really rest on the work of Kalestus Juma, who was a professor at Harvard Kennedy School. And he really looked at the history of innovation throughout, again, time, civilizations, and so on. And he really looked at why some innovation didn't spread in certain countries and it did in others. And so, you know, you had the printing press that didn't spread in the Islamic world and it did in Europe, for example. And he looks really at many of these instances throughout history of when and where and why innovation did spread in some parts of the world and not in others. And he really identifies, you know, people being left behind or seeing their value system being shattered as a crucial element. And so the point I make there is, you know, the technological side is difficult. And of course, if you talk to engineers, they tell you how hard it is to roll out all these renewable power plants and so on. But I almost argue that the social dimension that enables the technological dimension is just as important, and it requires careful reflection. And again, I'm not talking necessarily about flat out redistribution, because many of these people don't want cash handouts. They want to be part of this transition. And this, you know, here I rest on the work of Places Left Behind by Rodriguez Pose at the London School of Economics. And he would argue, you know, that part of the Brexit referendum result or part of the Trump election result is because of regions that feel they are being left behind by technology, by innovation and whatnot. And so we really have to avoid that. But I argue that it's also possible in a green transition to do that, because many of the jobs that we are going to create with the transition are labor intensive. They are actually less prone to delocalization, because part of it is construction early on, and part of it in terms of, you know, the wind, solar, and so on, but also in terms of taking care of these new power generation plants. And again, these tend to be local jobs. They tend to be diffused. So again, not so much like the digital revolution that is concentrated in a few selected platform companies, but it's rather a diffused system, and it doesn't require immense training. So again, we're not saying to a coal miner that he has to be a programmer, become a programmer at Google. We're saying to a coal miner, maybe there's a bit of retraining that is needed in order for you to be able to install solar panels on top of a house. And here the gap, again, I'm making it trivial and like a little story, but there is evidence in this respect that sees that the skill gap is much lower and therefore, again, more.
Thanks a lot. So there are a couple of questions. There was the first question, but the person who posed the question actually had to leave. I would like to share it anyway for a quick reaction, and it's about the use indicators. So basically what Marie Corman asks is, would we need different indicators if we focus more on quality rather than on quantity? This is a point that was made by Daniel and came up several times. Alessio, would you like to say something on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a first part of the book where I try to understand why growth became so central and why politicians across the board target it to a certain extent, and elections are won or lost on how much percentage points of growth you generated. There is, again, a narrative out there that is like, you know, all of this is the result of economists whispering in politicians' ears and telling them to focus narrowly on GDP. And that's how I come a bit to this discussion on indicators. Do indicators matter? And so on and so forth. And the argument I make is broader, and I say, look, it's actually not because of that. We measure, I mean, GDP sort of tracks growth, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but sort of does a decent job at doing that. And growth matters because it gives you resources to get stuff done. And the stuff that you want to get done can be anything. It can be in the green dimension. It can be reducing inequality. It can be build housing. It can be build hospitals in order to tackle a public health crisis, and so on and so forth. That being said, I'm not saying that we should narrowly focus on GDP, because GDP doesn't tell you how you're using those resources. And so there's two ways to go about it. The first main way is to use democracy. I argue in the book, in the sense that one reason why I think that democracy has proved as an effective way of governing resources or partnering in with capitalism is that capitalism is good at churning out resources, but that's it. And democracy, when it's partnered to it in an effective way, is about redistributing resources in a way that is fairer, and so that raises the living standards more and better, rather than the appropriation of selected few in an Acemoglu, why nations fail type of mindset. However, this doesn't mean that additional indicators don't help out. So with democracy, you've got to wait for elections, you've got to wait for a strong signal to be sent by the electorate that gets angry about an issue, and so on and so forth. Whereas perhaps having extra indicators allows a policymaker to be aware of these problems as they develop, and in a quicker way, and to tackle them. So if there is a housing crisis, you want to realize it from the indicators you have, rather than wait for people to get angry and punish you at the ballot box. And this is part of a wider argument as to why you can complement GDP with additional indicators, for example, on CO2 emissions, which gives you a sense of the speed at which you're greening the economy. It can be partnered with inequality indicators that gives you a sense of how this extra growth is accruing to which part of the population, and so on and so forth. But, and I think that's a crucial but, the fact that you broaden the horizon and you have these this wider scoreboard, or this beyond GDP dimension, doesn't wash away the need for growth, the need for resources in order to achieve those wider targets that you set for yourself.
Thanks a lot. Daniel or Barry, would you like to say to add anything on the indicators?
So I think about two kinds of higher quality that can be internalized by the consumer, and the price system ought to take care of it. The actual existing price system, higher quality Swiss watches should command higher prices. We know that the price system is not perfect. Think non-fungible tokens or whatever your favorite example is, but to a first approximation, it ought to take care of that, but the price system doesn't price external effects. And that's where we have to worry about those other indicators or corrective policies.
I was going to ask, I was expecting to continue to say, and there are aspects of quality which are not in the price system, like whatever, the environment when you go out, how the city looks, whether you feel safe, and so on. Is that not part of welfare as well?
Alessio, do you want to react?
Yes, I mean, so I see the price mechanism as central. And so again, I'm in the book, I in a way, I say that capitalism can be used as an ally against climate change, but I'm not saying that it's going to do it on its own. And that's why there's a list of things that governments can do. You have the standard carbon pricing argument that economists make in order to reinsert some of those externalities into the system. So I'm a great defender of this mechanism, and in a way, the aspects that are not taken care of and that are localized, and this goes back to what you were saying, Daniel, get taken care of, I would argue, by the democratic process. So why did California at some point decide in the 60s and 70s to improve the air quality? Because there was public protests about it, and therefore regulation was passed, and therefore the capitalistic system sort of adjusted to it. And that's also why you see better everything also on the environmental dimension in richer countries rather than in poorer countries. Even though GDP doesn't measure this, you still see higher quality air quality in I don't know, Rome rather than New Delhi. And this is not because we use a better GDP indicator, but rather because you have more resources to tackle this problem.
If I may, just a comment. So this year, I taught a part of a class, and with the students, we had a seminar, and we came across the issue of greening the economy. And one of the students came up and say, actually, what you are telling me just for rich people, just the rich, those who can afford to buy more expensive goods, which are typically greener and of better quality, can be part of the transition. It's not for the others. So you are just explaining me something which is unfair. So and this is actually okay. It was quite a reaction and was big debate. But somehow actually brings me back to a point that was made earlier, which is I could reduce to the sort of utility function of individuals and what you put in it. Whether it's just the quantity you want to consume more, or you want to consume better, and what kind of budget constraint you have, because you are optimizing under constraint. And on this, I think it becomes a bit more complicated.
I mean, the only reaction I would have in the book, there's a section where I really try to look at what I call the innovation treadmill. And so how innovations, when they come on the line, and not only in the green dimension, all types of innovations are expensive when they come out first. And therefore they are just for the rich. And we've seen that for cars, we've seen that for phones, we've seen that for TVs and so on. And all of these things now are considered, if you don't have access to most of these things, now in the European Union, you're considered borderline poor. Whereas 50 years ago, it would have been only for the richest of the richest. And the reason why is that early on, technologies are expensive. And then the more you produce them, the more they walk down these cost curves, the more they spread, and the more they become part of our day-to-day reality. And I am confident that we're going to see more of this. And I'm confident that this is going to bring co-benefits with it. So again, the fact that pollution, in-city pollution, will reduce. And it's not the main feature. It's not why we're electrifying cars. We've lived with that for a long time. But it's going to bring co-benefits which are localized, which again re-brings the whole discussion into something that you're doing for even narrowly in the light of self-interest rather than for some ethical, only driven by ethical considerations or what you owe to the next generation. And we are going to see a lot of that, I would argue, because of the green transition.
So we have only a couple of minutes left. I would like to take one of the questions because we had a very patient attendee. So there is a question which is the following: how do you see the causal relationship, if any, between inequality and growth, and which conclusions, if any, may be drawn from this for combating climate change?
I mean, I go along more a type of argument a la Piketty, in the sense that what he argues is we are seeing a growing inequality because of a reduction in growth rates rather than the other way around. And so that if we manage to rekindle growth or to accelerate growth and you have more resources, you will get the more redistribution that you desire and that is needed. And I think that we will see more redistribution also because getting the green transition done will require more redistribution in the form of a larger government that takes care of a variety of things. Also because when extreme weather events increase, when uncertainty increases, that's when, let's say, successful societies come together to share more resources. And that's where unsuccessful societies break down. And so I would argue that in order to remain successful or to keep society together, we're going to need more of this in the light of heightened uncertainty that we're going to see and heightened scarcity that we're going to see as a result of the beginning of climate change that we're seeing already these days.
Thanks. I think that with this you also addressed another question. Barry, would you like to say something before we close?
I'm going to avoid the inequality and growth question, except to say I see the relationship as complex. I do want to devote 30 seconds to the issue of technological trajectories. Economic historians typically start the semester with the story of the QWERTY keyboard, about how the private sector left to its own devices may not fasten onto and develop the optimal technology. So I think the question of the role of the public sector in guiding the development of private sector investments in technology is a big and important issue here that we need to keep thinking about.
Thanks a lot. Daniel, last big comment?
Finally, point to disagree. I think this QRT story is really overdone. But let me perhaps make two considerations quickly on technology inequality. Historically, and here I think Barry can confirm that, have not been the poorest of the poor who were the Luddites, but people in the middle of the income spectrum, people who had some skills which were made redundant. And I think we see that also in the yellow vests, which were not the poorest of the poor, but middling people. So if you think about technology and climate change and inequality, it's not in the typical one, the very poor against the very rich. It's the middle class, so to speak, which feels displaced. And we have also, somebody mentioned it earlier, the feeling of being displaced, the non-economic aspect. Finally, I would warn against overemphasizing learning curves in technology. Of course, renewables to some extent become competitive in some applications, right? But this doesn't mean that this curve will go on forever, and in the end we can costlessly reach the net zero. The cost can be much reduced, especially for the initial steps. But I think all experience suggests that the marginal cost of abatement will greatly increase over time, and the hard choices are still to come.
Alessio, the last word for you, and then we close.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the book would take a different line of argument, and what I find, I take a historical perspective. Given we started with it, and I stand between towering figures in such a context. What I find striking is that constantly at different points in time there has been this idea that, you know, the innovation left in a certain sector or sphere was limited, and that in the end there was limited the progress that could be made, especially at turning points. And there was, you know, I was reading yesterday something about the early 1900s and how people saw civilization as unsustainable without horses, and that the cars were limited in what they could replace. And we know how that went. And we see the early history of the Industrial Revolution, and we see Adam Smith not even mentioning coal and steam when writing about a pin factory. So picking even a different sector to explain how the economy works, just because, you know, it wasn't seen as fundamental. And I think that we are at a point again that we're going to see that. And I think what is crucial is that we're not going to see, even Barry was mentioning the counterfactuals, we're not going to see the counterfactual. So I don't know if in an alternative scenario in which we can continue burning fossil fuel in 50 years, that would be cheaper than the green option. And we're not going to see that. And that is a scenario that doesn't exist. And what we will be comparing that will be to the alternative technology that is at hand at that point in 50 years, which if in 50 years, it will be more expensive to use fossil fuel alternatives than the green option.
Thanks a lot, Alessio. Thanks a lot, Barry and Daniel. And thanks to everyone who listened to the discussion. I hope this raised your interest in the book, which I want to advertise. And Have a good evening, everyone. Barry, have a good day. Bye-bye.